Hi there, this is Llarold, and this is my in-depth Brewmaster Monk guide for Season 4 of Shadowlands. I will cover all the usual stuff I do in a class guide, including Covenants, Legendaries, and pretty much everything you need to know to succeed while playing Brewmaster Monk. I will also try to emphasize seasonal stuff when talking about gearing, since there's going to be a lot of very different gear options available to players this season now that all 3 raids are able to drop high item level gear, and the dungeon pool has been radically changed. I've done the usual thing of putting in chapters so that you can skip around as needed. And you know what they say, it's not really a YouTube intro if you don't beg people to like and subscribe, so, Let's start with what's changed. Nothing. Now let's move on to the what's good section. Brewmaster Monk is what's good. The class is super duper mobile, which is really good in raids for bosses like the Jailer, Painsmith, Halandris, Sylvanas, and either version of Artificer Zymox. Monk wasn't really very good against the initial version of Sire Denathrius, but thanks to the gigantic health pools that monks have now, I think the class is going to be just fine tanking every single piece of content in the upcoming season. Brewmaster Monk is probably stronger right now in Mythic Plus than it has been, I think, the entire time Mythic Plus has existed. So going back and doing Karazhan and Mechagon with a much stronger version of Monk than we had at those times is going to be really satisfying, I think. Also, doing Mythic Plus versions of Warlords of Draenor dungeons is just going to be awesome. I know it's a little bit controversial, but at least for me, I'm extremely hyped about doing old dungeons like the design style of Mists of Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor, where they're very direct. Just 2 trash pulls, then a boss, and you just repeat that 3 or 4 times and you're out of there. I think that's going to be fun and fast. Monk has been really tanky throughout Season 3 and very easy to play in both Raids and Mythic Plus, and I just really can't wait to play it in Season 4. I think the new versions of old content are going to be a lot of fun, and Monk is still going to be extremely strong. Let's start with Brewmaster Monk's tier set bonuses. The 2-piece bonus grants extra damage reduction from Breath of Fire. This is a little boring, but 4% damage reduction is actually very strong. Breath of Fire uptime is usually around 75 to 80% as well, so it's really a pretty good bonus. The 4-piece is obviously the much more interesting part of this tier set. It adds a ton of value on a Keg Smash, and it's really just great for everything. It adds a lot of damage, it adds a steady source of self-healing, and increases your max health by a ton. It scales really nicely into AoE as well. The healing increase is shockingly strong. I had expected this to get nerfed at some point during Season 3, but it never did. So I guess we can just assume they intended Monk to be this powerful, and I'm not going to complain about that. You absolutely want to get this 4-piece bonus as quickly as you can, and then pretty much just wear it until Dragonflight. It doesn't affect your talent choices or legendaries or rotation or anything really, so unlike some of the other classes, I don't think I really have to do a side-by-side, here's how you play with the tier set and here's how you play without it. It's more just like, hey, here's how you play, and once you get the 4-piece bonus, it makes all the keys feel about 5 key levels easier the moment you put it on. Let me finish up by saying you should want to equip your head, shoulders, chest, and pants. Helm and gloves are both pieces without versatility, so you can get away with dropping either of those and then replacing it with a legendary or an offset piece that has versatility on it for better itemization. Thanks to Season 4 letting you kill Sire Denathrius and convert the helm he drops into tier with the Creation Catalyst, you can get a higher item level helm than the one Anduin drops. So if you manage to get that drop, helm would be the better slot than gloves to wear with that 4th piece of tier. Generally speaking, the difference between helm and gloves in your tier set isn't really that big of a deal. Both are good, that's just sort of a late gearing itemization type of deal. Because legendaries are not going above 291 item level in Season 4, the gear you can get from dungeons and raids is eventually going to outscale it. Because of that, you are going to want to wear your legendaries in relatively low stat budget slots like belt, bracers, and gloves, and then wear normal gear in the high budget slots like chest, pants, and helm. Let's move on to covenants. The best covenant for Brewmaster Monk in Mythic Plus and raids is still Kyrian. It adds the most damage output, it's the best for on-pull threat, and generally speaking, it's just the best, most popular covenant at all levels of the game. That being said, Necrolord has been defensively very good in Mythic Plus. I would say I only play Necrolord when I've been doing the Necrolord dungeons, Theater of Pain, and Plaguefall, when I had to fill the Necrolord role. And in those situations it was very good, but it's generally a weaker choice than Kyrian's more straightforward offensive approach. I think the only spot in Season 3 where I needed the specific damage boost I could get from playing Necrolord was on Mythic Rygalon, which was obviously a raid fight, not Mythic Plus. And since Season 4 has gotten rid of all of the dungeons where you have any sort of Covenant interaction, I think it probably loses quite a bit of value in Mythic Plus and Season 4. For a while in Mythic Plus, if I needed extra tankiness, I chose to play Night Fae. Unfortunately, I think that whole thing was basically a pipe dream. It's functional, you can make it work, but it's a lot harder to be effective because of the annoying positional requirement of having to fight on top of the Fae line, and the value of Soul Shape in Mythic Plus is really limited. I also played Venthyr some of the time just for Sanguine Depths and Halls of Atonement runs, and while it was fine, I wouldn't recommend it for anything except messing around and just kind of trolling. It is actually a pretty fun playstyle to create burst AoE windows where your goal is to score as many crits as you can in 24 seconds, but the lack of synergy with the tier and legendary and just the whole kit is a real problem, and the overall performance just wasn't there. So Night Fae and Venthyr, they're both pretty much dead at this point. In Season 3, I would say you could have played them to cover a missing Covenant buff in a dungeon if you needed, but with Season 4 dungeons no longer having that, they're just dead. Kyrian for damage, Kyrian pretty much for everything. Necrolord is really only something you should play if you absolutely need a lot more tankiness than you feel like you're getting. But you're going to sacrifice damage output and on-pull threat to get that extra defense, so it definitely shouldn't be your default pick. I will say one note in raid, I probably will still play Night Fae on Painsmith, just so that I can have the Soul Shape to teleport through balls, but that's basically it. Moving on to Soulbinds, and we'll start with Kyrian. Use Mechanicos. Hey, that's pretty much it. You'll want to use him set up like this and run this tree for everything. He is simply the best. If you opt to play Necrolord, Marilith is the best Soulbind there. You get more personal damage value out of Marilith than any of the other Soulbinds, and if you remember to use your Fleshcraft often, you will get extra stat buffs from nearby corpses in Mythic Plus, which gives you a lot of value that, again, you're not getting out of the other two trees. I wouldn't use Hermir most of the time, but if you are desperate to gain a little bit of extra defensive cover when you're doing a raid boss that might enrage and kill you, Hermir's 10-second lifeline can be pretty nice. Just to quickly go over Night Fae and Venthyr, even though they really aren't optimal to play, I think their Soulbinds are actually very good. Naya is the most appealing part of Night Fae for monks. I wish that Night Fae worked because I would like to play with Naya. Her top of the tree trait, Grove Invigoration, grants 1% health and 25 mastery for every stack. You generate 4 stacks every time you cast Feline Stomp. And, you know, they last 30 seconds, but they don't refresh for the duration, so they stack up and fall off. Basically, you can maintain about 10 to 20 stacks while tanking in Mythic Plus, which is pretty fantastic. Also, you get about 250 to 500 free mastery, which is just about as good as the health is as well. I wish the Feline Stomp had ever been buffed to the point that this would have been a viable Covenant option, but it wasn't. And finally, to cover Venthyr, General Draven is the best Soulbind there. He's super tanky and the free stat budget he provides is very nice. Not nice enough to justify playing Venthyr, but if for some reason you want to, he's pretty nice. Now let's cover the conduits that I think you should run in every Soulbind setup. The 3 good potency conduits for Brewmaster Monk are Walk with the Ox, your Covenant conduit, and Scalding Brew. Walk with the Ox is very good. It buffs your Nizao and cuts his cooldown down by a really large amount of time. The cooldown reduction procs from every tick of Spinning Crane Kick, so using Spinning Crane Kick in single target instead of Tiger Palm is a DPS increase if you're able to get more Nizao casts off. The Covenant conduits are all very simple, but really good. Scalding Brew has good synergy with the 4-piece tier set bonus. It's a really nice boost in your offensive power and your health and healing, and you should always run it once you have the 4-piece bonus. Endurance conduits are also pretty simple. You have 2 good options and the rest are all very low value. Harm Denial grants you extra self-healing with Expel Harm. It does not affect the healing you get from Gift of the Ox Orbs that you consume with Expel Harm, so it's not that big of a bonus, but it is still the most consistent, best on-demand self-healing increase available through conduits, so I would recommend using it as your number 1 endurance conduit. Condensed Animosphere is the other good endurance conduit. It's just a steady trickle of healing. Every 10 seconds you get a proc of healing. Kinda boring, but not bad. And finally, Finesse conduits. Tumbling Technique and Swift Transference both add decent mobility that's useful in raids. Neither of those are game-changing, but they are okay little bonuses that can help you be even more mobile when you need it on what is already a super mobile class. Dizzying Tumble is a bit more of a Mythic Plus option. It grants minor damage reduction after your leg sweep fades from enemies. It's a pretty small bonus, but it has defensive value as a finesse conduit, and that's a pretty terrific thing to get. I usually run Tumbling Technique or Swift Transference for a little bit more mobility in raids, and then I just forget to swap this out for Mythic Plus. But you know, if you want to get every advantage you can and you focus primarily on Mythic Plus, I would recommend running this, and then forgetting to swap it out for raids. Next up is Legendaries, and there's only 2 Legendaries powers worth wearing as Brewmaster Monk now, and those would be Stormstout's Last Keg and Unity. If you wear anything else, you're making a mistake. You will want to make your Legendaries with Versatility and Crit. Now in terms of what slots to craft those in, that can be dictated a bit by your gear, but ideally you want to run Stormstout's Last Keg in your belt. Unity you can put pretty much anywhere it helps maximize your stat budget. Because Legendaries aren't scaling above 291 item level, you actually want that to be in low budget gear slots such as bracers, boots, or gloves. The big advantage of Unity is that you can equip it anywhere except weapon or trinket slots, so basically use it to cover up your worst gear slot and you should be good. Alright, let's move on to talents. Here's the default talent setup. You're going to want to use this about 95% of the time. The primary talent swap I would recommend is running Dampen Harm in raids and Bob and Weave in Mythic Plus. In the first tier, I prefer Chi Wave in all situations. If for some reason you find yourself playing Night Fae, Chi Burst has a weird little interaction with Phaeline Stomp where every single hit of damage and healing that it deals counts as a chance to separately reset Phaeline Stomp. So in that one case, you should run Chi Burst, but otherwise, Chi Wave is sort of a little bit more try-hard option in this tier. Again, I prefer it over Eye of the Tiger because it gives you something that you can use to generate a lot of threat during taunt swaps in raid, or to generate a little bit of threat and deal a little bit of damage anytime you're out of melee range, again, in raid or in Mythic Plus. Eye of the Tiger is fine, but it does mean that you're going to have to Tiger Palm whether you're an AoE or single target, at least every 8 seconds to maintain that buff and actually get some value out of it. Again, another reason not to run Eye of the Tiger and instead run Chi Wave. In the second tier, I generally prefer Tiger's Lust in all situations. I think that Chi Torpedo is a decent option in raids, but for Mythic Plus, I would say even if you like Chi Torpedo, I think Tiger's Lust is better. Being able to clear roots is really, really valuable, and the control it gives you when you have to do any sort of kiting in Mythic Plus is also really good. Again, I just think Tiger's Lust is better than She Torpedo all the time, but you can use whatever you prefer. Light brewing is really the only option in the next tier. Spitfire is basically worthless, and Black Ox Brew is technically a decent option, but it's way more work to use than light brewing, and there's basically no reward for all of that extra effort. It pretty much just winds up being about the same, arguably worse. Ring of Peace gives you a ground-targeted AoE knockback. This is really useful in Mythic Plus, and it can be excellent in a lot of raid fights too. I liked it on Anduin and Kel'Thuzad just off the top of my head. It's really good on Spiteful weeks, which it is right now during the time of recording this, or when fighting trash mobs that just like to fixate on your party members. Black Ox Statue is not usually that useful, but it can be extremely valuable for raid fights with large numbers of adds that stream in but have normal threat tables. Council of Blood and Stone Legion Generals are the two main examples I can think of there. Bob and Weave is better than Dampen Harm in Mythic Plus because it's just a lot more reliable. You basically should always use Bob and Weave there. If you forget, it's not the end of the world, but I would always recommend it over Dampen for Mythic Plus. Where I think Dampen is better in raids is because it's an extra defensive cooldown, and there are plenty of spots in raids where you can get hit by a big burst of boss damage, a Sylvanas combo, a Jailer combo, multiple big Rygalon hits in a row, a Cyrogen Athreus combo. For those situations, having Dampen Harm as a really sizable damage reduction cooldown is very valuable. If it's a fight where you're just sort of getting hit pretty hard all the time, such as Anduin, Bob and Weave is actually a better choice even in raids. Special Delivery and Rushing Jadewind is a bit of a player preference choice, at least in Mythic Plus. Special Delivery deals slightly more DPS than Rushing Jadewind in AoE and dungeons. The long, powerful slow is very helpful for kiting as well. It's 50%. It was never nerfed, unlike Keg Smash, which is only 20%. I've played both a bunch, and I still prefer Rushing Jadewind. It's just more comfortable to me. It is the better setup to run in raids, and I think that's why it's more comfortable in Mythic Plus to still just stick with Rushing Jadewind. Rushing Jadewind also helps a lot with threat on pulls, since it's a skill you can precast and you can get 5, 6, 7 seconds of free damage from it as you start the pull without having to recast it. But the difference there is relatively minor. Again, it's a preference thing. Both options are fine. Anybody who tries to tell you that you're making a horrible mistake by not playing Special Delivery is being a little histrionic. The difference really is small enough that you can just play what you like, and I would recommend trying out both and figuring out which one you like more. And in the final tier, High Tolerance is the only real option. Celestial Flames has never been useful, and Blackout Combo was good in Legion, so they nerfed it in BFA, and then they increased Blackout Kick's cooldown in Shadowlands just to shovel some dirt onto Blackout Combo's corpse. Yes, Blizzard, it's very dead. Let's talk about the basic rotation, how you should start pulls, and manage your cooldowns. I'll put the rotation up on the screen here, and there's really only one change you need to make between the single target and AoE rotations, and that's how you handle Blackout Kick versus Breath of Fire. Breath of Fire is a pretty weak skill, but it is an AoE. So you want to use Blackout Kick over Breath of Fire in single target, and prioritize Breath of Fire over Blackout Kick in AoE. In either case, Keg Smash is your primary offensive and defensive skill. Expel Harm is your main self-heal. You use Breath of Fire and Blackout Kick as much as you can and prioritize them depending on whether you're fighting one enemy or a pack. You fill with Chi Wave if you have it. And then, lastly, you use Tiger Palm or Spinning Crane Kick as your rotational last resorts. They're filler, so you shouldn't be using them over any of your skills that have more value. You can know that the other skills are more valuable because they have cooldowns, but Spinning Crane Kick and Tiger Palm don't. Let's talk about pulling. Monks have a really strong toolkit for generating threat on pulls. I'm going to walk you through how I handle pulling packs in Mythic dungeons. Generally speaking, the way you want to start off a pull is with Keg Smash. I like rushing Jadewind and Chi Wave because I can cast both of them prior to getting into range to use Keg Smash, and if that Keg Smash misses any of the mobs, I'm still going to generate some threat with the rushing Jadewind and the Chi Wave. If I was using Special Delivery, I make sure to cast Spinning Crane Kick immediately after Keg Smash, just to be absolutely sure I've tagged everything, and thus would have threat. Spinning Crane Kick is generally a very good skill to use for situations where you're moving and trying to pick up threat, even if you have Rushing Jadewind, or you're trying to gain threat on an enemy that's not attackable because it's still doing some sort of annoying RP. Getting the first hit on enemies is very important when establishing threat, and Spinning Crane Kick hits multiple times a second, so it's really good for scoring that first hit. Now, because we're using the Conduits Scalding Brew, our goal is to get Breath of Fire up before hitting the majority of our Keg Smashes. You obviously can't do it with all of them. The very first Keg Smash has to be applied before you can get Breath of Fire to go up, and maintaining the 4-piece bonus is much more important than anything else for your defenses. So, you never want to hold Keg Smash long enough that you lose that 4-piece bonus, but on the opener my goal is to Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, and Keg Smash again. I may have to use Keg Smash twice right off the bat if I have a DPS who is rolling into a pack with a ton of massive cooldowns and I'm worried about threat, or if a pack is really spread out and, I'm just struggling to actually hit all the mobs with each Keg Smash. Maybe I'm trying to pull 2 or 3 packs together at once. I Keg Smash one, roll over, Keg Smash the next, get them all gathered up, Breath of Fired, and then proceed to Weapons of Order and start hitting them with those slightly more empowered Keg Smashes all together. Now, if you're not playing Kyrian, that affects your opener, because you're not able to use Weapons of Order if you're not Kyrian, and I think that is the primary thing that monks who play Necrolord and struggle with initial threat do wrong. Bone Dust Brew doesn't generate threat, it doesn't do any damage on its own at all. Because it's a good skill and you don't want to waste any cooldown of it, players will try to use it as early as they can in a pull, which makes sense conceptually, but if you're using it as the opening skill, where you're wasting a GCD or using a GCD but not generating any threat, that can cause mobs to sprint all around you, run to different members of the party, and start tearing them all up. So whether you're playing Kyrian, Necrolord, or even Venthyr, you want to focus on using Keg Smash and Spinning Crane Kick and Breath of Fire to get initial threat on the pull, get the whole pack of mobs gathered up, and then use your Covenant abilities once they're under control, and you can proceed into your normal rotation without the fear of, again, mobs sprinting all over the place. In terms of managing offensive cooldowns, for the most part I just use Covenant abilities on cooldown as much as I can. The main times where I hold them during a pull is in Mythic Plus if the pull is almost over as Weapons of Order or Invoke Nizao comes up. Weapons of Order has a really long ramp up time. It takes about 20 seconds to get fully stacked, and it lasts a really long time from the start until the final debuff expires. Again, about 20 seconds of ramp up, and then 25 more seconds of fully stacked value. So 45 seconds in total. It's a great skill and a really big buff, but it is a skill that you want to use on pulls that are going to last for a while. So in raids, if you're in a fight like Lords of Dread and the Among Us phase is coming up in the next 20 seconds, you shouldn't use Weapons of Order because you'll wind up getting it fully stacked, and then the bosses will despawn and waste the rest of your buff. Unless you want to use that buff to kill your raid members, which would be bad. Also in fights like the Jailer, if you're about to be sent out of melee range for more than 10 seconds, popping Weapons of Order and getting a couple of stacks up, then having to run away and let it fall off, so you have to start stacking it back up again with 15 seconds less of your max duration, isn't great. You want to just hold it until you can be on the boss for a good long time. Painsmith is another fight like that. On that fight, I feel like I spend so much time out of melee range that I really struggle to maximize its value at all. So in that case, I try to just do the best I can and use it mostly on cooldown. If he's about to enter an intermission phase, I would hold it until he comes back down, but otherwise, just let it rip. On the subject of Nizao, you never want to overlap the Nizao from the Kyrian Legendary with your normal, regular Nizao, as they consume each other's stomp bonus from your Purifying Brew casts. Previously, I have said that I don't really do much to maximize the extra damage I get out of Nizhao stomps, and that's certainly true in Mythic Plus. In progression rating on the Jailer, I did do a lot of turning my back and sitting down to guarantee that I would be crit, and I thought it was really good for damage output, but I really hated the playstyle. I would not recommend it in the slightest. I just think it's like really goofy design, and definitely not the intended way to play the game at all. That being said, if you play the game pretty much just the regular way in Mythic Plus, and you make use of Nizhao and you are aggressively using your Purifying Brews while he's up, on Fortified weeks, he's going to do a lot of damage. That's pretty much the extent of the way you want to use Nizhao. It's just while he's up, you try to purify as much as you can and try to really get some big staggers going so that he can do a little bit more damage. I wouldn't recommend anything super degenerate like sitting down. It's pretty dumb. In terms of using Purifying Brew and Celestial Brew, I generally try to use both of these abilities once I have taken some damage and I'm a good bit below full health. In terms of what that value is, it's something you kind of have to feel out based on what kind of content you're doing. With Celestial Brew, since it's such a big shield, I really like to be able to heal myself back up with Expel Harm during the time it's up, and actually get some health value out of the Expel Harms instead of just wasting them on overhealing. That's more of a Mythic Plus thing. In Mythic Plus, I usually wait until my health starts to dip a bit before I hit Celestial Brew. If there's some big boss hit that's, very telegraphed, I will try to precast Celestial Brew for it, but that's usually not super common in Mythic Plus. In raids, it's very common, and I'm pretty much always on the lookout for those kinds of abilities whenever I'm going into a boss fight. Just to name a few of them: Painsmith weapon throws, Sylvanas combos, Denathrius combos, Stone Legion generals, punches and swipes, Rygalon strikes, Jailer combos, Jailer's shattering blasts, Jailer's cleaves. Pretty much anything that you would call a boss combo or strike or cleave, you're going to want to cover with Celestial Brew and maybe Dampen Harm or Zen Meditation or some other cooldown as well. With Purifying Brew, I generally want to keep at least one charge on cooldown all the time. Otherwise, I'm basically waiting to take a little bit of a hit before I chug that second charge. The same tends to go for Expel Harm. It's a great healing skill, and I kind of tend to hit it like Death Strike. Obviously, it's not going to heal nearly as much as Death Strike, but I do look at it as, I just took a big hit, my health spiked down, bam, Expel Harm. I get a pretty decent chunk of health back. Hitting it when it's just gonna fully overheal you wastes your energy and puts it on cooldown for 5 seconds for no reason. Fortifying Brew is your primary defensive cooldown, and I generally try to plan the pulls in Mythic Plus where I intend to use that a little bit ahead of time. I usually want it to be in spots where I know it won't overlap with other good cooldowns such as Weapons of Order or Invoke Nizhao. I also like it to obviously not overlap with on-use defensive trinkets or Dampen Harm. Those are options I try to use on things that are a little bit less dangerous. So like if I'm pulling together 2 big, very nasty elite packs, that's probably a situation that would call for Fortifying Brew. In raids, I try to use Fortifying Brew for mechanics that either hit extremely hard or will last for a while. There's a period in Rygalon during the downstairs phase, for example, where I take like 3 strikes in a row and soak an orb, and that's a spot I love to cover with Fortifying Brew. Dampen Harm is a nice defensive cooldown as well. It's a bit weaker than Fortifying Brew, but it is on a shorter cooldown, so it's available much more often as a sort of mid-range defensive cooldown. It's something you can use on really dangerous hits if you're also layering it with Celestial Brew or a trinket of some kind, or you can just use it kind of to soften up some of the less dangerous attacks if you're using it only on its own. Now let's briefly cover kiting. Monks have a really powerful toolkit for kiting. Roll, Clash, Tiger's Lust, Transcendence, Ring of Peace, Leg Sweep, Keg Smash, and Special Delivery are the bulk of Monk's kiting toolkit, and that's a pretty huge toolkit. It's extremely easy to kite as a monk, and it's pretty forgiving because you can still deal damage with Keg Smash and Breath of Fire, and potentially even Spinning Crane Kick and Rushing Jadewind. while you're outside of melee range, which allows you to, for the most part, keep threat while not necessarily being auto-attacked. You could technically just roll away and vivify yourself if you really need some sort of self-healing, although with the acquisition of the 4-piece bonus, I don't think I've really had that moment pretty much at all during Season 3. Usually kiting on a monk now takes the form of stepping out of melee range for a few seconds when your health is super low and Celestial Brew and Expel Harm aren't up, getting some healing either from your healer or by hitting Keg Smash, and then moving back into melee range and continuing to fight as normal. I think the only real exception is on necrotic weeks, which, again, it is a necrotic week right now, and in those cases, you have to actually stay out of melee range for quite a little bit of time. It's pretty annoying, but targeting the furthest enemy away from you, clashing it into the pack and rooting everything, and then running out of melee range, just annoyed for 5 seconds, and then getting back in, tends to work pretty well. If you're not able to pull that off, getting down a ring of peace for yourself or using a leg sweep and then rolling away, that does a pretty good job too. Now let's talk about stats and gear. Versatility is the most important stat. It's the best offensive and defensive stat for monks. You should gem and enchant versatility. Critical Strike is the second best stat for damage and the second best overall because it increases your healing intake. It's pretty close in value to versatility, but it doesn't actually reduce your damage taken, so it's a tiny bit weaker. Mastery is a pretty decent defensive stat against auto attack damage, but it doesn't really do anything against spell damage, or dots, or special attacks, or anything that you can't dodge, so it's inconsistent, and both Kyrian and Night Fae monks, for what that's worth, get a decent chunk of mastery from their covenants, so it's really not ever worth trying to stack up. The most important thing to go after when you're gearing up is your 4-piece bonus and your legendaries. Those take top priority. After that, it's mostly just about item level. Aside from trinkets, item level is almost always more important than itemization. Previously, I've said that dual wielding is better than using a two-hander, and that is generally true, but Zovastrum, the two-handed weapon from the Jailer, is so perfectly itemized, and it comes at a higher item level than the majority of weapons in the game, that it's actually just as good as dual wielding. Cruciform Vein Ripper, the one-handed weapon from Painsmith, is slightly better for single-target DPS, but the difference between dual wielding and using a Zovastrum is seriously like 30 DPS in single target, and Zovastrum is much better than Cruciform in AoE because it has secondary stats on it instead of just a single target damage proc. Now as for enchants, let's just go slot by slot. As for your weapon, Celestial Guidance is a very good enchant. It provides a solid mix of offensive and defensive value, and because it's a personal buff, it's very consistent. You should always have this on at least one of your weapons, so if you're using a two-hander, just Celestial Guidance. If you're dual wielding, I recommend Sinful Revelation as your second enchant. It's a bit more reliable as a DPS increase on priority targets than Lightless Force. Lightless Force tends to add more damage in sort of AoE trash situations, which is fine, but it's a little bit wasteful and, really less important on the big, dangerous mobs that matter more, where Sinful Revelation's going to give you more value. As for other enchants, be sure to put Agility on your boots, and I prefer Avoidance on Cloak. Some people like Speed, but I think Monk is fast enough. Okay, let's go over some of the gear that's going to be available in Season 4 that is a little special, and talk about how to spend your dinars. This is a currency you acquire by killing bosses in raids, and you use it to purchase items from 3 vendors standing over to the right of the Great Vault. They will sell you up to 3 items in total, then they disappear. They sell weapons and trinkets from the 3 raids. So basically you want to buy the best weapon and trinkets you can, and that's it. The items you buy are normal item level, which is 278 or 285, but with another currency you acquire by killing raid bosses, you can upgrade them to heroic and then mythic. As far as I understand, this is the way it'll work with gear that drops normally in normal and heroic raids, but that's been difficult to test. So let's run through the important pieces of gear you want to pick up from this system. I already talked about the difference between Zovastrum and Cruciform Vein Ripper, and I will say that is your call, but Zovastrum is arguably just as good as 2 Cruciform Vein Rippers, and it costs 1 dinar, whereas dual-wielding Cruciform Vein Rippers costs 1 dinar each, so 2. That's very expensive with a really limited currency like this. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis is the best defensive trinket in the game. It drops from the 9 in Sanctum of Domination. That's an early boss and generally regarded as one of the easier bosses in the expansion, so killing them and looting Shard is an ideal option. That's sort of the one hang-up I have with recommending that anybody just buy this trinket outright. It's not as difficult to get one normally as most of the other items on the list. The drop rate isn't incredibly high, but it is a lot higher than Reactive Defensive Matrix, a trinket that I never managed to get to drop on my monk, despite doing like 700 billion clears of Sanctum of Domination. That being said, this is very strong. It reduces a flat amount of damage from all hits and all dot effects while it's active, and that calculation includes all damage reduction effects, such as stagger, and it works on stagger ticks. So basically, this is total damage immunity while it's active on a monk, but without losing threat, like Divine Shield. I'm surprised it never got nerfed, but I guess I just like how strong it is. This trinket is strong enough that I would actually recommend doing LFR to try and get it when Sanctum of Domination is the fated raid of the week. Even at 265 item level, I think this trinket is strong enough to go toe for toe with any other trinket you can get out of Raid or Mythic Plus, even when they are at higher item levels. And it's just such a good idea to have this trinket available when you need a big defensive cooldown. Reactive Defensive Matrix is a really good combo of both shielding and damage output, and it really performs well while tanking when you have really high uptime. Bosses like Sludgefist, Rygalon, and Mythic Plus are the main spots where it shines. I see this as a trinket that you could put onto a monk and pretty much never take off for the rest of the expansion and be pretty nice. Elegy of the Eternals gives you a moderate chunk of versatility. At 278 item level, it's worth 121. It also grants 10% of that, so 12, to your party members. It's a good trinket, probably the weakest of this collection of 3, but it's still good for all-around value, and it doesn't require you to be tanking all the time to maximize its value like Reactive Defense Matrix, and it doesn't require you to be taking big, like dangerous bursts of damage that you need a cooldown for, like Shard of Anhilda's Aegis. Stone Legion Heraldry is a similar trinket to Elegy of Eternals, except it only grants versatility, and at least at the time I'm writing this down, it grants more than Elegy of the Eternals does, so it's just better. Nice. Cache of Acquired Treasures is a very strong DPS trinket from raids. I wouldn't recommend going out of your way to buy it with dinars, but if you get lucky on the other trinkets and you don't need to buy them, this is a pretty cool option. It's a really good DPS trinket, especially in AoE. If you use the Axe buff, it makes your enemies bleed whenever you crit them. And because of Rushing Jadewind and Spinning Crane Kick and Keg Smash and so on, you're critting all the time. So you basically have permanent uptime on a very, very big dot for the 25 seconds after you use this trinket. It'll make your DPS absolutely skyrocket in AoE if you use it well. On fights that have ads, I've generally found this to be worth like 20 to 25% of my overall DPS for the fight, even if I'm only getting like 2 uses in a 5-minute fight. That is it though, it's just for DPS, so again, not as high of a priority as the stuff I mentioned before, but pretty sick if you can get it. Finally, Weave of Warped Fates is a normal cheat death trinket. It doesn't really do anything except prevent your death, and the 8-minute cooldown is very long. It's an option if you feel like you need more defensive value and you haven't gotten some of the other trinkets that I've mentioned prior to this one, but unless you get insane levels of gear drops while you're farming up your dinars and you already have basically everything else on the list, probably even including the Cache of Acquired Treasures, I wouldn't recommend buying one. I think cheat death is a bit of a crutch. It can be useful for preventing raid wiping deaths when damage is high and unpredictable, so I like them conceptually for progression rating, but I tend to think of them as passive defensive cooldowns. This one is an 8-minute cooldown, and that just seems worse to me than an active defensive cooldown like Shard of Vanhilda's Aegis, or even the passive damage reduction and the 20% health lifeline that you get out of Reactive Defense Matrix. Shard of Vanhilda's Aegis and Reactive Defense Matrix is a really strong tanky trinket setup that can keep you alive through pretty much anything. If you find that you don't need a big defensive cooldown trinket, you can swap out of the Shard for Heraldry or Elegy, and still have a really good mix of stat budget, offensive value, and defensive value. You could run double versatility trinkets, and that would be fine too. You could also run a versatility trinket and Cache of Acquired Treasures if you're really trying to pump up your damage in AoE. Now let's move over to the gear that comes from Mythic Plus dungeons in Season 4, and remember, all of the Shadowlands dungeons other than Tazavesh are no longer in the rotation, so Blood Spattered Scale is going away. Codex of the First Technique from Tazavesh was nerfed fairly late into Season 3. It's a passive proc that provides a fairly small amount of damage reflection, 10% after all mitigation effects, up to a cap of around 11,000 or so depending on item level. That looks like it would work like a smaller Enhilda's Aegis that has way higher uptime, and that is the way it worked prior to the nerf. It doesn't work on Stagger anymore, and that has severely hamstrung its value for monks. It's not anywhere near as good defensively or offensively as it used to be. It can be okay on a boss with a ton of dot damage like Rygalon or Painsmith, or Sylvanas, I suppose. But the last time I used it on Mythic Jailer, it did 50,000 total shielding in a 10-minute fight. It wound up being worth about 100 healing per second, and I think it did about 80 DPS as well. Not good. Definitely better off just running a versatility trinket that has no proc at all. Salia's Secret Technique from Tazavesh Gambit is a good versatility trinket option. It requires someone else in your party to be running versatility, which isn't super common. I would say this is kind of like a problematic version of Elegy of the Eternals or Stone Legion Heraldry, and not really a high priority trinket just because of that, but not bad either. And if you get crit instead of verse, honestly, still not bad. Ticking Sack of Terror is a pretty good offensive trinket from Tazavesh. It's decent for Brewmaster, and it will add a good chunk of damage in both raids and Mythic Plus dungeons. This is like a solid A- offensive trinket. I think it's better than a B+. It's decent. It's not the absolute best, but it does perform really well, and it's super easy to use. You put it on and it does damage. The end. Mechagon gear is fairly simple. I would say the main pieces of valuable gear here are the rings. Ideally, you want a logic loop of recursion to trigger the ring effect, and either an overclocking bitband or a shorting bitband. I think the shorting bitband is better for monks because the shorting bitband just deals damage directly, whereas the overclocking bitband gives you a haste proc. Generally speaking, haste isn't a terrible stat for monks, but it's generally one of the lower value stats. So I think just getting that free extra damage out of the shorting bitband really is the best way to go. The other notable pieces from Mechagon are weapons and remote guidance device. Remote guidance device is a pretty basic damage trinket. You press the button, it does some single target damage and some AoE damage. That's it. As for weapons, there are actually 3 different pieces I want to mention. Cranial Recalibrator is a perfectly itemized one-hander for Brewmaster Monk. It's just a regular weapon, but it's perfect. Second is Salvaged Incendiary Tool, which procs a very powerful dot on enemies. It doesn't have secondary stats, but during BFA that didn't matter. It was strong enough to compensate for that with the power of its dot, so I think it's a good weapon option to consider as an offhand, just to tack in some free extra damage. And third is Reclaimed Shock Coil. This doesn't have great itemization, it has a bunch of haste, but it does proc for a pretty decent amount of free damage, and that's nice. It is a two-hander, so this is definitely the weakest option of the 3 here, but it still has extra value beyond its item budget, which is great. Karazhan has several decent pieces of gear as well, so let's run through them real quick. The Choker of Barbed Rains from Atamen can provide a decent damage proc, and the stats are pretty good. Drape of Shame increases critical healing and has perfect stats, so it's really solid as a defensive option. I've recently been told that the healing buff does not work on self-heals, and there's not really a good way to test that right now. I guess maybe it doesn't provide any self-healing value at all. There's really no way to know yet. You'll probably have a healer trying to rip your heart out if you want to keep this cloak for yourself anyways, so I guess just let them have it. Maybe. I don't know. Those stats are pretty amazing. Eye of Command is a very simple trinket. It grants a lot of crits, so it's a pretty good option for Brewmaster Monks. It does have a bit of ramp up when you switch targets, but if you're dual wielding, it should only take about 12 to 15 seconds to ramp up to 10 stacks. Even if you're two-handing, it's maybe 20-something seconds to stack up to 10. Not too bad. It does reset if you swap to kill an explosive or an important ad, so it's not my favorite trinket of all time either. The Ring of Collapsing Futures is very decent. It adds a free damage on use effect. That part is good, but the itemization of the ring really isn't for Monk. I would say that if you get one, you can use it until you put together a Mechagon ring set, but if you already have a comparable item level versatility ring, I'd probably give it away to somebody and make somebody else's day. Seal of Darkshire Nobility has pretty good stats and an okay defensive proc. This basically just makes the start of a Mythic Plus pull about 10% less dangerous. That's actually very good. The start of pulls is usually the more dangerous part of a fight, so getting a free minor defensive cooldown out of a ring that's also got a huge amount of versatility is pretty nice. I don't think this is worth foregoing a Mechagon ring set to wear, but at least in the time where you're building up to that, it's a good option. Finally, let me cover the drops from the two Warlords of Draenor dungeons, Iron Docks and Grimrail Depot. I was expecting Blizzard to make some changes, but that didn't happen. Warlords of Draenor dungeon loot tables are enormous, filled with 60 plus items in each of them, mostly just consisting of almost identical rings and gloves and bracers and so on that have almost, but not quite all of the possible stat configurations. There are a couple of pieces that aren't available in Crit Verse. I think some gloves, maybe some bracers are not available in leather with crit and versatility. Kind of a bummer. The rings and necklaces all have agility on them, which might seem good, but because of the agility, they are tuned to have much lower secondary stat values. Basically, they just aren't tuned right. So these rings and necks from Warlords of Draenor are actually somewhat weaker than equal item level rings and necks from Legion, BFA, and Shadowlands. If you get a perfect wad ring or neck like agility, crit, verse, it probably is worth wearing unless you have an equally good non-wad jewelry piece competing with it. But basically, I wouldn't go out of my way to farm any wad jewelry, and I probably wouldn't wear any of it unless it is perfectly itemized and I didn't have something pretty close in value that didn't have agility on it. There are a couple of weapons available from Iron Docks, but they aren't great in terms of itemization, so not really worth targeting them either. There is one piece I would recommend target farming on Brewmaster Monk out of Grimrail Depot, and that's the trinket Thunder Tower's Targeting Reticule. This trinket's very nice. It just gives agility and versatility. They're both passive and that's it. It's pretty much the same as Elegy of the Eternals or Stone Legion Heraldry, but hey, that's fantastic. I wish that Blizzard had done a better job of retuning the WoD loot tables so that strength tanks had access to similar WoD trinkets that gave strength and verse or strength and haste, but hey, they didn't. Maybe this makes up for Season 4's old Warrior Souls scaling up to like 311 item level. Well, that's it on trinkets and important Season 4 gear. If I didn't include a piece of gear in this massive list, it's probably because it's not very good. It can still work while you try to get your hands on some of the items that are on this list, but it shouldn't be a permanent solution. As we're approaching the end of Shadowlands, Brewmaster Monk is still very, very strong. It's been the second best tank in both raids and Mythic Plus. It's always been good in raids, but the fact that it's been really good in Mythic Plus has been very surprising to me. Monk's really strong and really fun right now, and people like it. Even Pure Mythic Plus players are fans of Monk. How cool is that? Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Brewmaster Monk and Shadowlands Season 4, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands and Dragonflight content, and thank you for watching. Bye.